I'm going to show real quick the steps for pulling the sides up or pulling the walls of a pot up. First off, we have centered and opened this pot. Now we're going to pull the walls up. To do that, what I like to do is have my hands touching each other on the inside and outside of the pot. They can be doing that close down here or up top, or some way of supporting it. I like to feel that my hands are together. That helps me to pull consistently up. Now what I'm going to do is start all the way down at the bottom and basically press in at the bottom and then take that chunk of clay that I've created. Watch what happens when I push in at the bottom. It creates kind of a bump of clay, you can see right there. And I'm going to pull that chunk of clay up from underneath on the outside. Your clay has to be wet to do this, so I'm going to continue on where I left off. Pull all the way up, pulling that clay, supporting consistently on the inside and the outside of the pot. In this case, probably be a mug. So again, I'm going to come in from here, press in, and then bring that clay up. I have the wheel going a little slower than I normally would to demonstrate this so that you can kind of see the clay slowly going up. Make sure that's wet. Alright. I'm going to do this again more at a regular speed that I would do it at. Normally I would be pulling up more like this. You kind of want to wait for one rotation and then go up a little bit more. I ended up going slow anyway just to demonstrate that. The challenge with pulling up too quickly is that you'll end up with a spiral, which kind of looks cool, but while you're pulling up the walls of a pot, you don't want a spiral. So let's do that again. I'm going to push in at the bottom here. And you can use, a lot of people pull with a knuckle. Some people pull with their fingers this way, some people this way. Some people use a throwing sponge, which is a thinner sponge that you would actually set down there that keeps the moisture of the clay on the outside at a nice consistency. But I just use my fingers and I pull up kind of like this. So I'll dig in this side here, and on the inside this hand will be actively kind of following as I pull all the way up the full length of the pot. So I make a little bubble of clay there, and then I'm going to pull that clay up all the way to the top. And when you get to the top, you kind of release a little bit. Right? We don't want to squeeze the lip of this too tightly and ruin it or anything. There we go. Let's do this again. We're going to pull up the wall. When you get good at this, pulling up a wall, you could do it in 1 or 2 pulls and pull up more clay at one time. You can also start to shape the pot into whatever shape you want. What you want to do when you're first pulling is try and keep it fairly cylindric. Try and keep these walls as upright as possible. And sometimes when the wheel starts going and we first start, we have a tendency to go outward. And you can see I've gone out a little bit there, but these are pretty consistent. And if you ever want to bring it in, just wet both hands, hold on both sides like this, and this is called collaring it in. And you can actually straighten up those sides so that they're a little bit more like a cylinder before you begin pulling again. And that's kind of a practice that, especially when you first start pulling, that you'll probably be doing pretty regularly. One other thing I want to advise is when you're first starting to practice pulling up walls, that you'll start to feel like the clay is too thin. It's going to break. It's too thin. So I recommend that get to that point and then do it again. Try going for this throwing and pulling consistently, and be okay with breaking a few of these pots. If you're making mugs, be okay with breaking some mugs, because until you actually pull the clay too much, you're not going to really know how far you can pull the clay. And different types of clay work differently, so it's hard to know exactly when you're going to break it, but you'll get to know that a little bit more as you practice. Because this is an introductory level video, I want to show some of the common mistakes that we make when first pulling up walls of a pot. So I'm going to show in this one the same amount of clay as I did in my previous example, only pulling up without doing those things that I said to do. So what I'm going to do is start off by, instead of pressing down at the bottom, which I'm now doing of course, but instead of doing that, I'll do that for this first pull, I guess. What sometimes beginners tend to do is to just go in up a little bit like this instead and just pull up the wall starting there. Okay. I'm having some fun here with this already. So I'm starting up a little bit and pulling, and as I'm pulling up, I'm adjusting the consistency of my hands. So you can see the wobbling start to happen. The lip is going all funky, right? The straightness of the lip has a lot to do with how consistent you are when you're pulling up the sides. So I'm still gonna keep the clay pretty moist as I'm going. I'm still connecting both fingers just out of habit more than anything. But what I'm trying to do is, as I'm going, I'm squeezing harder and softer, a little bit harder, and then a little bit softer, a little bit harder, and a little bit softer as I go. And as you can see, it's wreaking havoc to the lip of this mug here. It's just really all over the place. And this is some things that are common among first potters, and you'll end up with this really big sort of pile of clay at the bottom. Remember, this is the same amount of clay as I did with the previous example. So I should be able to pull this up 6 inches, right, and get a 6-inch tall cylinder here. But instead, I'm like one fist, not even a fist tall, right? So let's go ahead and do that again. Okay. Again, pulling inconsistently has led to a lot of problems on this. And I've been exaggerating it on purpose, but you can see that I've seriously caused some pretty serious problems with the look of the outside of this. Alright, let's take a look at these 3 mugs and try and figure out what happened. With this first mug, you can see a couple of things went wrong. This is the extreme example that I did at the end, where I squeezed tight right here, and you can see that the walls are extremely thin, and then I loosened up a bit, so you get this inconsistency where it's sort of thicker wall here, thinner wall here, thicker wall here. So we get kind of this wobbly pattern there. And that's what happens when we don't hold consistent throughout our pull. Also, you notice down here at the bottom that there's a whole lot of clay. Look how much clay is there. This is the same amount of clay as all the other examples, but you'll get a much smaller mug. You're going to get a mug that's about 3 inches tall, and look how much is inside. It's a really small volume of water or whatever you're holding inside your mug. You'll also notice that the inside edge kind of wobbles and the outside edge wobbles as well as we get that thinner and thicker side. With this, the bottom is actually not a terrible thickness, but it is still pretty thick. That's pretty thick for the bottom. You would have to fix that in trimming. So what you'd basically do to try and fix this is you would have to trim almost a foot. Well, you'd probably trim off the entire bottom like that, and then you'd trim a foot here, and then you'd have to trim off probably all of that to get yourself a good shaped mug. So you're cutting off that much clay all the way around the entire mug. Basically, like half of your clay weight is being lost. So you can definitely see that there are some problems with that one. On this mug, this is like a middle of the road example. It's not bad. And certainly for starting, you know, this is pretty decent. I'm going to say that that's not a bad bottom thickness. You've got thicker at the bottom, thinner at the top. When you're throwing a pot, you need support at the top for all of the weight that's there. So you're not going to have exactly the same thickness on the bottom that you do on the top, but you're trying for pretty consistent, right? So we do have a fairly consistently tapered shape here, right? It is thicker than we would want. So this is going to feel heavy for a mug. It's going to feel like you've got a lot of bulk. Again, if we're going to draw the lines on there, let me grab my needle tool here. You'd probably cut a foot in here, right? Have it come down and then cut up like that. Like you'd almost need to trim that much away, or at least up to about there. So you'd end up with, you'd have like a foot there and then maybe trim up like that or something like that. So you're cutting away all of this to be able to get a really nice weight of a mug, right? You'd have to cut away quite a bit. And again, this is not a terrible example because we do have a consistent taper on the sides. So if you're getting to this point, this is a good place to be and you're making good progress. Certainly if you're coming from our previous example of wobbly, different shaped sides, like really inconsistent, and you're coming to this, that's making good progress. Now let's look at our final example. In this example, again, you do notice that it's thicker at the bottom than it is at the top. Because we're going up 6 inches in this mug, we do have to have a little bit of bulk at the bottom to support that weight. But again, you have a consistent taper all the way up. So that's actually not a bad mug shape. Notice the bottom, little thinner, right? So we don't need to trim off a whole lot of weight there off the bottom. I would personally trim off probably a little bit there, right? And get yourself sort of more of a mug shape, more of a mug feel. I wouldn't trim very much of this though. I would basically be trimming that. So you're saving a lot of the clay compared to the previous examples. And this, it could have been a little thinner through here, honestly, in this example. It's not perfect, but the fact that it's pretty consistent throughout is actually is what we're looking for here. So these walls were pulled up fairly well. So you can definitely see the difference between these examples. This one here we're getting about 6 inches of usable mug when we get to this example here. When we go on to our next example, we're having much less. We're dropping that down to about 4 inches of usable mug. And then in our final example here, we're getting, the height is actually just about the same, 4 inches. But then you look at the volume inside, and we're talking about the difference of having like an inch, almost not quite 2 inches at the bottom, to having a good 2 inches at the bottom. And then at the top, you're at 4 inches, and this one's less than 3. So the capacity of this mug here is easily twice as much as this one. We're throwing away a lot less clay with each example as we go. There we go.